what's the difference between like a more traditional company and a radically decentralized organization?
A traditional company will have typically a kind of pyramidal hierarchical structure where you will have roles like managers, and they kind of coordinate things, and kind of information and decision making kind of cascades down the organization.
Yes.
Whereas in a radically decentralized organization, those closest to the work can make decisions about the work. And that does not mean that there is no hierarchy, that there is no structure, that there is no leadership. Those are other common misconceptions. It just means that they are different kinds of hierarchies. So they tend to be more dynamic hierarchies that are kind of role-based, and hierarchies based on kind of experience and expertise. When you start moving towards this kind of radically decentralized model, you realize that traditional organizations are built on these fundamental assumptions that employees are thieves and irresponsible babies, basically, that need to be controlled and monitored. Otherwise, they will, destroy things, which is deeply sad. And I think a lot of organizations are kind of built on this, almost like this 2% rule. There was 2% of people who abused the system, and so we implemented a rule that negatively impacts the 98% of people who would have made, good decisions in the best interest of the company.
How do we transition from that to a real radically decentralized organization?
We need the same paradigm shift in leadership and in organizations as we had in science, when we went from one paradigm of science to the introduction of quantum science, which sort of totally turned everything upside down, right? So she said we need the same quantum shift in leadership and organizations. If there's a break in a spider web, what does the spider do? It connects the web to more of itself. The same is true of organizations. So when you realize there's a tension here or there's a problem, rather than trying to solve that, it's like, how can we connect the web to more of itself?
Hi, and welcome back to New World in the Making. Today, I am thrilled and honored to have Lisa Gill with us, a facilitator, coach, and leader in radically decentralized and self-organizing organizations. For me, this is something like a full circle moment in a way, because years ago, I read Reinventing Organizations, and for those who know me, know that was a very important moment in my life. It really flipped my understanding of business and collaboration upside down, and it sparked a fire and a knowing of that things could be done very differently, more humanly, more connected, more purpose-driven. And Lisa is actually one of the people that is actually walking that path. She helps organizations turn theory into living, breathing practice. She guides teams in building workplace cultures and these inner shifts based on trust, autonomy, and shared responsibility. So I'm deeply grateful to have her here. And I can't wait for you to dive into this conversation with us. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Just a quick one, and I promise quick one, before we dive into the episode. I really want to take a moment to just say thank you for being here. And to keep this work alive and help it reach even more people, I need your help. Just by hitting that subscribe button, you're becoming an active part of this new world in the making. And you're enabling this conversation to grow into directions we can't even imagine yet. So thank you truly. And now for real, let's dive into today's conversation.
Lisa, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Me too a lot, because we're talking about a lot of different important things for me. But before we go into everything that I would love to hear all your insights about, can you share a bit about your background story? How did you get to the place that you're in today?
Yeah. I'm trying to think, what's the short version? I think it took me a while to find my purpose in life, you could say. So I studied drama originally at university, and I thought I wanted to be in the arts because I'm a very creative person. But I found trying to get into the creative industry was very frustrating because I was bumping into lots of hierarchy and annoying things. And then I ended up by accident in a training company in London because a friend was working there and I was just looking for any job at that point. And I ended up really enjoying it and became interested there in organizational development, like organizational culture, leadership, these kinds of things, and started going to conferences and getting inspired by the more radical ideas. And then I left that company and I set up my own company and began my journey of kind of exploring and learning about more decentralized ways of working without managers and things like this. And I read Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux and was very inspired by that. So that was around 2015. And then I had the chance to collaborate with him a little bit on the illustrated version of his book, which was wonderful.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I feel very lucky that I had that opportunity. And then I met a lot of people along the way who were also sort of inspired and moving around in these spaces. And I joined an organization called Tough Leadership Training in 2016. And their specialty was less about the structures and processes of reimagining organizations and more about the kind of mindset shift and the inner transformation that's needed for us to work in more participatory, decentralized human ways. And I became very inspired by that. And then I've been working with them for the last nearly 10 years now, leading trainings around the world, helping people with that inner shift. And in the meantime, kind of researching organizations that are doing progressive, radical things and sharing those stories with people to embolden and inspire people. So yeah, that's the short version.
Wow, lots of different questions here already, but maybe let's start with because I know that you don't like the term self-managed organizations so much. Maybe can you explain why you don't like that term so much and why you prefer is it radical decentralized organization? Is it that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was a term that I discovered recently, radically decentralized organizations, which came from this Finnish researcher called Perttu Salovaara. And there are quite a few of these organizations in Finland, also in the public sector, which is quite
Oh,
interesting. Their
okay.
culture seems to lend itself well to that kind of way of organizing. And until I came across that term, I had been wrestling with my dislike of self-managed organizations or self-managing organizations for a while. But it's kind of the most widely used term or understood term, especially in like academic research and stuff like that. Like Michael Lee and Amy Edmondson, they wrote a paper a few years ago. And they had this debate about which term should we use, and they went with that one. So it seems like for now, maybe we need to use that term. But I prefer radically decentralized organization because self-managed puts an overemphasis on the self.
Mm,
And
yeah.
then you get these misconceptions of, oh, self-managed, that means I can do whatever I want. Or, people can end up becoming a bit sort of siloed or everything kind of gets taken over by individualized needs. Whereas actually the organizations that practice this really well are able to balance the sort of self and the collective or the whole. So I prefer a radically decentralized organization because it doesn't put that emphasis on self. And the kind of radically part means not just decentralized in the way that some startups or tech companies say, yeah, we're really flat, but actually intentionally radically decentralizing across the organization, even as you grow, I think is more accurate. But it's still not perfect for me because it sort of misses some dimension of human relational, I don't know. So I haven't found the perfect term, but that's the closest I've found.
Okay, amazing. Maybe for somebody that doesn't really know what we're talking about here so much, could you draft, just have like a broad overview of what we're talking here and what's the difference between like a more traditional company and a radically decentralized organization?
Yeah, good question. So a traditional company will have typically a kind of pyramidal hierarchical structure where you will have roles like managers, and they kind of coordinate things, and kind of information and decision making kind of cascades down the organization. So if you are like a frontline employee and you want to make a decision, you usually have to go through several layers of hierarchy for that decision to get made.
Yes.
Whereas in a radically decentralized organization, and there are organizations that are like, thousands of employees. It's not only small organizations that can organize in this way, but the principle is that those closest to the work can make decisions about the work. And that does not mean that there is no hierarchy, that there is no structure, that there is no leadership. Those are other common misconceptions. It just means that they are different kinds of hierarchies. So they tend to be more dynamic hierarchies that are kind of role-based, and hierarchies based on kind of experience and expertise. So it's almost like leadership flows to where it's needed. And those who are in kind of quote unquote leadership type roles are more conscious of when to step in and when to step back. So no one can decide anything about anyone else without their involvement, if you like, and there are different ways of doing that. There's no one size fits all version of doing that. And different organizations prioritize different things, but that's the general principle.
Okay, so can we maybe move into a little bit more of a concrete example? How do these companies, make decisions?
Yeah. So when you transition to this kind of organization, or when you want to start one from scratch, decision making is an interesting one, because we forget the statistic of like how many thousands of decisions we make every day. It's a lot, and we make all of those very unconsciously. We're not conscious that we're making those decisions often, and we're not conscious how we're making those decisions. And the same is true of teams. So we usually make decisions in traditional organizations through kind of autocratic decisions. The manager decides, or if you're a bit more involving, maybe you might use like a majority vote or consensus if it was an important decision and you wanted everyone to agree. But when exploring like self-management or decentralized organizations, we need to learn some more decision-making methods. So those might be consent-based decisions, for example, where instead of saying, okay, does everyone agree on this? You might say, does anyone have any objections of this proposal? And try and integrate objections if there are objections, and then aim for, can we live with this? Is it safe to try? And that is the difference between consent and consensus. And then there are other methods like the advice process and different things. So it's more deciding how we want to decide.
Okay.
Is a key part of that.
Yeah. Can you explain that advice decision making process as well? Because I found that one to be very fascinating when I read about that one in Reinventing Organizations. And how does it work in practice?
Yeah. So some decentralized organizations pretty much run entirely on the advice process. So the idea is that anyone can initiate a decision-making process. So let's say I want to make a decision about something. The idea is that I'm empowered to make that decision. And in order to do that, what I need to do is get advice from people who have experience and expertise, and people who will be affected by that decision. So if I'm going to make a proposal to change something financial, it would make sense that I go and talk to, someone in the finance department and get their advice and their input. And if it's going to affect a lot of people, then I may want to seek advice from more people than if it's just a small decision. But at the end of all of that, it's really up to me what I do with that advice. I could choose to disregard it all and continue to make the decision, but then that's going to have implications, and maybe it harms, people's trust in me. So the idea is like you're trusting individuals to make decisions and trusting that they'll seek input and advice from the relevant people.
Yeah. And that's happening like right now, right? Like it exists because
Yes.
I think for a lot of people, this might seem a bit like, but does this actually work? Like, can people just decide on using a budget that no one told them that they are free to be able to use it? Like this happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And it reminds me of, I interviewed this very charismatic founder of a Swedish company once for my podcast, called Björn Lundén. And he was saying that when people would visit his company, they would say things like, so you mean that any employee can choose to buy like a laptop or something? And he was like, yes. And they said, well, what if they buy like a really expensive one that's like really unnecessarily expensive? And he's like, well, then people would think you're a stupid person.
Crazy. Yeah. I mean, like we tend to kind of then suddenly think about people in a very kind of child parent way, right? So can you maybe explain also here how does that change the perception of us as human beings working together? And how is it traditionally, maybe in more traditional companies?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really good point that you bring up, because when you start moving towards this kind of radically decentralized model, you realize that traditional organizations are built on these fundamental assumptions. So, to give you an example, like in the book Reinventing Organizations, there's this manufacturing company, Favi, and they have lots of rules in place, which is very common in a lot of these kind of factories, where they had to, clock in and out when they started their shift. And if you wanted to get a new pair of work gloves, you had to go and ask the supervisor to get the key to unlock the tool cupboard to get your new pair of gloves and things like this. And the CEO, Jean-Francois Zobrist, I think his name was, he realized that the fundamental assumptions here are that employees are thieves and irresponsible, babies, basically,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
need to be controlled and monitored. Otherwise, they will, destroy things, which is deeply sad. And I think a lot of organizations are kind of built on this, almost like this 2% rule.
Mm.
There was 2% of people who abused the system. And so we implemented a rule that negatively impacts the 98% of people who would have made, good decisions in the best interest of the company. So when you start to look at that, you realize, wow, that's, and this goes, back 100 years to Frederick Winslow Taylor and classic management theories. And he had some crazy quotes that he thought employees were, I think he said, as stupid as an ox, and that you had to control them or they would, run amok. Whereas radically decentralized organizations are built on different fundamental assumptions, that people are trustworthy. And, most organizations today hire, the brightest, best people that they can find and then treat them like stupid, irresponsible babies.
So true.
Unconsciously, no one sets out to do that. But
Yeah.
that's what it's like when we look at these processes. So, what would your decision-making processes look like if you fundamentally believed that these are competent, responsible adults who will act in the best interests? And sometimes, sure, they'll make mistakes, and there may be 2% who abuse that, but then you deal with that 2%.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And on a personal level, have you experienced also a shift in your understanding of the human being?
Yeah, I kind of took a big breath in, because I feel like over the last 10 years, I've learned so much and challenged so many of my own assumptions about people. I mean, you mentioned this parent-child kind of dynamic, and that's a key part of what I'm doing when I'm leading trainings with people who want to work in more kind of distributed, decentralized ways, is trying to make ourselves aware of the ways in which we have internalized this parent-child, producer-consumer, kind of helper-helpless dynamic. There's so many different ways to describe it, but it's, broadly speaking, this kind of hierarchical dynamic that we're taught. It's ingrained in us in school and workplaces, often families, society, really. And we're not fully conscious of just how strong those internalized dynamics are. So for me, it's been like a key discovery of like, all of us have our different ways in which we become a bit like a parent or a bit like a, boss without meaning to, even if we think we're really empowering or really egalitarian. For me, I like to help people. I like to be helpful and useful, and I'm a people pleaser. So my version of being like a parent is taking care of people. It's like in Sweden, they talk about curling parents, the winter sport curling, where you sort of prepare the ice to like make the thing go across the ice. So you're like smoothing, clearing the path for people. So I have a tendency to do that. And I have learned to try and catch myself when I do that and see how me being in that way kind of robs people of the opportunity to be more responsible, to be more of their potential, really.
Mm, so beautiful. Yeah. No, I identify as well. And- yeah, that's yes. Yeah. For sure. And how do you see now? Like you've been working in this field for over 10 years now. How has it developed? Because yeah, I could imagine that there has been a lot of different waves as well. How do you see the space right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're having this conversation at a moment in time, which is, it's been 11 years now since Frederick's book came out, for example. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Barcelona at a conference organized by the Corporate Rebels, and I was hosting a panel conversation with Frederick Laloux and also with Jos de Blok, who is the founder of Buurtzorg. For people listening who haven't heard of that company, they're a healthcare company in the Netherlands with 15,000 employees and 0 bosses. So one of the most successful cases of a self-managing or decentralized organization. And they were founded in 2006. So that's like nearly 20 years ago.
Right.
And then, the organization I'm working for, TAF, was inspired by Ricardo Semler, who was, practicing this in the 80s. So in some ways, like, sometimes we call this movement like the new ways of working movement. And in
Yeah.
some ways, they're not really new.
Yeah.
But it seems like at this moment in time, there is a growing interest in seeking alternative ways of organizing, because we're feeling more acutely, I think, the limits of traditional ways of organizing, and we're seeing how that is kind of destroying people's well-being, destroying the planet's resources, all of these things. So although it's still a small minority, I mean, this conference that I mentioned, there were 220 people there, and Corporate Rebels have mapped about several hundred of these organizations around the world now. So we're not just talking a handful, we're talking hundreds. And yet it's still a very small percentage of organizations around the world. So whether we will see it tip over in our lifetimes or not, I don't really know. But it seems like there is a growing movement of people who are really committed to practicing, experimenting with these ways of working.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I just got so excited when I read the book, yeah, also 10 years ago. And I mean, we talked about this also last time we saw each other, and just that idea of, well, it's happening, you feel that there is the movement going, and there are lots of different people really excited about this. And then when I finished my master's and I was like, okay, I'm ready to go now to one of those companies, and I'm like, okay, what are these companies?
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, and I felt just very, I don't know, like a little princess asking for flexible hours, like real flexible hours. I'm not referring to it's okay if you come in at between 8 and 10. I mean, like real flexible hours where they trust you to just do the work whenever you feel it's at the right time, and that you can self-organize the team around the project. And because I was also just reflecting the other day, I was like, well, they trust us in universities, even where there is a very clear student professor hierarchy. But even in universities, they trust you with just providing the work, like just get get your work done, and you present your project this date, and that's it. And then you have to figure out a way about how you get there and how you work with your team and all that. So even there, they give you that trust of, well, you just figure it out. And then you go to the workspace, and then suddenly I felt like I'm an absolute weirdo asking for like real, free, flexible hours. And because I work way better maybe in the afternoon, evening, and rather than like early mornings. So it's like, what, how, so that was such a, mm, um, crazy realization. And at the same time, it's exactly what you're saying as well. Um, well, we're starting to wake up to like, well, these kind of ways of organizing, they don't really serve us. So I've heard you also talk about Gen Z in other podcasts. Um, I don't know, could you explain a bit more also from your point of view? What have you seen, and where are we in this? Because I've also heard you say something about Gen Z also demanding a bit of or expecting things from organizations, where I'm also like struggling with like, okay, yeah, this is like not maybe the space for figuring out your childhood trauma, like it's
Mm.
but maybe you can explain it a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. I was at an event earlier in the year organized by my friend Toby, who has this community called the Humanizing Business Network. And we had quite a range of generations there. We all sat by age order in this kind of horseshoe shape, and we had Gen Z all the way up to kind of Gen X. And the session was kind of, if I make it really blunt, was kind of like, how can we satisfy these demanding Gen Z talent who, want so much, and we know we need them because it's the next generation of talent, but they're so difficult. How can we manage that? And it was interesting hearing directly from the Gen Z people there who were sort of calmly trying to say, like, look, I understand your frustrations. And like, yeah, we can be outspoken and we can be demanding sometimes. But what you have to understand is that we're so much more driven by impact and influence and purpose than, climbing the ladder or earning money, because the dream or the promise of if you work hard, you can climb the ladder and then buy a house or whatever, that's out the window. That's not that's not on the table anymore. Yeah. And also like Gen Z have been through a lot of difficult times with the pandemic in their key school years and things like this, so they are they have a lot of trauma with a lowercase t, you could say, that they're bringing to the organization. So they're more interested in like making meaning, and so I think also that organizations have in many ways kind of overpromised, not just Gen Z, but I think in general we're sort of reckoning with, when you say to people, we're an inclusive organization and we want you to have a voice and speak up when you see things that don't work or, that we can improve. I think organizations didn't really think about what they would do with those comments when people started speaking up. And suddenly, it was like opening Pandora's box, and all these people were like calling out injustices and why can't we do this and da da da. And then sometimes I talk about it's like a pendulum, like the pendulum of doom. Then it's really easy to sort of overcorrect and swing back too far in the other direction of like, okay, now you just need to, shut up and get on with your job. Or so it's sort of challenging to navigate that. But again, it's easy to fall into that parent-child trap, which is sort of like, how can we the carrot and the stick with these Gen Z people. How can we lure them in like the witch in Hansel and Gretel and then and then keep them there? And it's like, well, they're also like talented, competent adults, have conversations with them, share like the challenges that you're having, and these things are possible and these things are not possible, and kind of co-shape things with them instead of trying to do things to them. That's what they're going to resist. So yeah, it's an interesting moment.
Yeah, no, for sure. You were already mentioning before the kind of maybe less hierarchical startup culture, or more agile, trying to make companies a bit more agile and all that. How do we transition from that to a real radically decentralized organization? How would you say what's necessary for us to be able to transition into that on a structural level? And you were also mentioning already the inner shift. What's neat?
Yeah, well, I often return to a kind of model or a framework that I learned from Mickey Kashtan, who is a nonviolent communications practitioner and author, and she's been a real influence for me. And she says that we need to undergo 3 shifts if we really want to move towards more decentralized and kind of purpose and values aligned organizations. It's like what we said about the fundamental assumptions. And those 3 shifts are, the first one is we need to reimagine the 5 core organizational systems. So we already talked a bit about one of them, decision making. So that's one. How do we make decisions? Another one is information flow. So how does information flow around the organization? Who gets to know what? It's very hard for me to take responsibility for something that I don't have information about.
Yes. Very true.
The third core organizational system is resource flow. In other words, how does money flow around the organization? How do we decide who gets paid what we spend on what? Also human resources, who does what, who's responsible for what? And then the fourth one is feedback flow. How do we know what good looks like? How do we know if we're going in the right direction? So we need these kind of feedback loops of like, what does good look like? And then finally, conflict engagement. So when we have conflicts, how do we deal with that? And if we don't reimagine those 5 things in line with our purpose and values, Mickey says, then we're kind of doomed to inherit the old paradigm versions of those core systems. So you probably wouldn't want to do all 5 at once. That would be a lot, but you could sort of pick one and maybe run some experiments like, okay, how could we make decisions in a way that's more in line with how we want to be? And then the other 2 shifts she talks about are inner shifts, as you said. So one is an inner shift in the people who have power. So if you're a manager or you're a founder or, someone who has a lot of experience in the organization, those people need to learn, like I said before, when to step in and also when to step back, and how to really listen and how to be more coaching instead of always giving advice and solving things. And then the second inner shift is an inner shift in those without power. So when you say to a group of frontline employees, okay, we're self-managing now, you can make decisions about anything you want. For many people, that's terrifying. That's like a huge responsibility that they've not been entrusted with before. So it takes more than permission for those people to really step into that authority. They need some time and support and space to try out new ways of making decisions, for example, to kind of voice concerns or ask for what they need. If you share the profit and loss statement with people, many of them will not know how to understand it or make meaning of that. So there's some education needed also if you want people to be responsible, as well as like the inner kind of abilities of, proposing things instead of waiting for someone to solve things for me, or giving feedback to my colleagues instead of feedback only being something that my manager gives to me,
Fascinating. Yeah, no. I totally can see those 2 sides of the same coin, no? This, how can I step back and let maybe other people kind of take control and take power in certain aspects? And also, how can I step up now, even if
Mm.
I don't feel like, oh, is this actually something? Yeah, no, I can totally see that. It's a different cultural, completely inner shift also of what you expect yourself to be, no?
Mm. Yes.
And what's your work in those areas? Because I mean, you already mentioned that your the organization that you work in right now is more focused on the inner shift, right? How do you create that? How do you make that inner shift possible, and how do you accompany them?
Yeah. So I think what I've learned helps cultivate those inner shifts is a couple of things. One is like to have spaces where I can kind of confront and become aware of, my automatic inherited tendencies. So like I said before, like what's my version of becoming like a parent, or what's my version of being like a child too? Like what's my version of kind of passing the buck or whatever it might be. So to kind of, we have these blind spots so spaces where I can get feedback and practice things so that I can become aware of my blind spots. And also in those spaces, opportunities then to practice and try out some of these alternative, more like adult to adult ways of being and abilities. So like I said before, like listening is a key ability, like really listening so people feel heard. Um, asking coaching questions instead of automatically giving advice or solving things. Giving feedback in a way that is, again, not giving advice, but rather giving feedback. You know, bringing up and navigating interpersonal tensions. So a lot of things that we don't learn in the classic education or workplace systems. If I can have spaces where I can practice, try out those things, kind of safe and brave spaces, if you like, because it's like for me to go outside my comfort zone and get feedback and be supported with other people like me, wrestling with that and bumping into all of the kind of growth pain of that. That really helps. And that's what we do at my organization, Tough Leadership Training. We have these programs where we try and create that for people, where they can, it's kind of like a dojo or a gym, really, where they can try out those things. And the final thing is spaces where people can share, talk about, feel heard in what can be difficult about these inner shifts. Like Frederick Laloux talks about, sometimes managers need like a almost like a manager's anonymous space where they can share with you, like, hi, I'm Lisa and I'm a former manager and I'm finding it really difficult not to be so needed anymore. I used to love having great, smart solutions, and now, that's not what's needed anymore. And I wonder, who am I, or what is my worth if it's not that? And for people to hear me in that and see me in that and support me, like, yeah, I feel you. I feel the same. And like, this is challenging. And so that's also really important.
Wow. Yeah. No, I can totally see that. I love the
Yeah.
I most love it.
I'm a recovering manager.
um have you seen a lot of resistance, especially I could imagine that maybe for some companies it's hard to see also the benefits of this. Like, how do they approach you? How do you make a point of like why this is important? Um, yeah, I could imagine that it can be struggle. Some yeah, it can be a bit struggling to find sometimes this. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right to ask that question, because it can be a bit of a pitfall, I think, to approach this kind of transformation journey from a superficial motivation. For
Mm,
example, people who say, we want to become a teal company. That's the kind of terminology from Frederick Laloux's book. Or we want to become a self-managed company. And that's not so inspiring. I mean, Frederick himself says like nobody wants to become a concept. So it's much more like valuable, I think, to be clear on like what is the purpose for you of embarking on this transformation. And again, like by that I don't mean like increased efficiency and lowering overhead costs. Those can be like side effects of this kind of process, and those are common results. But I think if you come from that place, it's kind of limiting as well. So I think it's much more inspiring. I mean, human beings are like storytelling, meaning-making creatures. To speak from a deeper purpose than that,
Yeah.
which might be, if you're a healthcare organization, it might be like, what if every decision we made was really focused on helping our patients lead more empowered, meaningful lives?
Yeah.
That's the mission of Buurtzorg, for example.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, then they thought like, well, then we shouldn't be measuring based on efficiency. Like, oh, if you spend 1.2 minutes giving a shot, then you can go next door and be more efficient. It's like, no, it's like building relationships is more important than efficiency. And then in the long run, that is how they've ended up being, so successful, like having a third of the overhead costs of their competitors, having like, world leading patient satisfaction rates and employee engagement rates, because they came from that place, the real human purpose of moving in that direction.
Yeah. No, 100% agree. But yeah, I could imagine that right now, maybe if you would say like, yeah, we don't have time for this, like we're just barely surviving in this economy right now. So we don't have time to actually now focus on, yes, we can put a purpose name here and we can just write a purpose here. The purpose is ultimately it's just to make money. So what are we doing?
Yeah. But it's interesting because some friends of mine are involved in this fund called Chrysos, where they raise money to buy and transform other organizations. And many times they buy. So their latest acquisition was an aluminium factory here in Barcelona that they bought in May. And they always have to get a majority vote from the employees. So a certain percentage have to say yes, or they don't go ahead with buying the company and transforming it in this way. Yeah. And so it's not just the owners that approve it, it's also the employees. And then they introduce some kind of key structures. They have these 3 circles that are made up of representatives, employee representatives from different teams. That one is like a kind of a steering team, if you like, and another is like a operational team, and the third is like a team that helps with culture and kind of interpersonal relationships and things like that. But these companies are usually like at the point where they are not making profit. Maybe they're on the brink of bankruptcy. So organizations that, as you said, might say, we don't have time for this fluffy stuff, or, to navel gaze or whatever. And yet these organizations that they've bought, the previous one, Endairo, was an aerospace company in Sevilla. And within a really short time, they had like record level profit. They had like reduced costs, here in Barcelona, this aluminium factory, even just since May, they've increased the profit margin by 5 points. And a large part of that was just listening, a lot of listening conversations, going around and talking to factory workers, asking what gets in the way for you to do your best work, and then listening and implementing really simple things,
Yes. It makes so much sense. I think it's just our old way of thinking that just gets in the way. And then we're like, well, efficiency, no safety. I also love, I've heard about you talking about this um, diagram where it's about emotional safety or psychological safety and also the kind of challenge and learn. Um, can you explain that a bit more? Because I think sometimes maybe exactly we could think, well, it's just about la di da fluffy talk, about being here and just enjoying and getting our traumas healed, and not about actually efficiency. Yeah, maybe explain that a bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in the same way that there are misconceptions about self-managing organizations or decentralized organizations, there are a lot of misconceptions about psychological safety. And one key misconception, I read this several years ago in an article written by a guy called Shane Snow, where he said that psychological safety does not equal psychological comfort. So a
Okay.
lot of organizations, I think especially organizations in the social impact sector that are very like people driven, can be easy to end up in this trap of what Amy Edmondson calls the comfort zone. So she has like a 4-box model where it's like psychological safety, accountability. So when you have really high psychological safety but low accountability, that's when you have this comfort zone trap where it's like we all care about each other and it's all great, but it's kind of like a false harmony, prison of pretense, and that breeds its own dysfunctions. And people don't grow or develop there. So it's in the end, it's not kind to have that kind of
Right.
culture.
Right.
And then, of course, if you have high accountability but low psychological safety, then it's like the anxiety zone. So I think most organizations nowadays try and avoid that. So you want this sweet spot of both. You want accountability and psychological safety. Or put another way, safety plus discomfort equals growth and development.
Love
So
that.
yeah. And that means like holding each other accountable, and accountability not being like a dirty word or something punitive, but rather something that's part of our shared commitment to one another and the purpose of this organization, which means that we, call each other out. We give each other feedback if something's in the way, or we say to people when, you have not done what you promised, without punishing them or shaming them or blaming them, but saying, how can I support you? Or what do you need to kind of recommit to the things that we had committed to?
Yeah. Yeah. And in that, how is conflict management in that environment? How does that work?
Yeah. So again, and I think we're, similarly to what I was saying about Gen Z, we're in an interesting moment where I don't think we help people in organizations where we try and create, super inclusive cultures. Um, Again, we can fall into the trap of like becoming parental and trying to protect people and kind of bubble wrap them. And then you get these cultures of fear where people are really scared of saying the wrong thing and upsetting someone or hurting someone's feelings. And the HR team is overloaded with HR cases because nobody has learned the ability to deal with their interpersonal tensions themselves. So they kind of pass the buck to someone else, to their manager, to HR. And even if that gets resolved, it creates this unpleasant climate where you're kind of looking over your shoulder all the time. So the alternative is, I really believe that all of us need to upskill ourselves and upgrade our mindset, how we relate to conflict, and also upgrade our abilities of doing that, being able to bring things up, being able to listen to others, being able to place it between us of how can we together find a way to work together that meets my needs and your needs in the best way possible, knowing that not everyone will get their preference. It's like, again, Mickey Kashtan talks about this of like mutual willingness. So if I understand what your needs are and you understand what my needs are, and I feel heard in my needs and you feel heard in your needs, we're much more likely to find a space of mutual willingness, which might not be my preference or your preference, but mutual willingness of like, okay, now that I feel heard in my stuff and I understand your stuff, I'm willing to, be flexible and find something that meets both needs.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. And yeah, because it's really not about then compromising.
Mm,
Has nothing to do,
exactly.
like, it's just such a different wording and such a different situation. I love that. And what do you think, how is that related to maybe vulnerability and also rising of consciousness? So I feel like that there is a lot of there here, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm very present to an article that I read this morning on Substack, uh, and I can't remember the name of the writer, but I can share it with you if listeners are interested. But they were writing about the authenticity trap, um, and I think it's interesting because, again, to go back to Frederick Laloux and teal organizations, one of the kind of breakthroughs of teal organizations is this concept of wholeness. Bring your whole self to work. And this writer was saying that that is kind of a trap when you say that to people, because you can end up kind of performing authenticity and constantly asking, oh, is this authentic, or is that me seeking approval, or and the other problem with that is that at the event the other week, someone asked Frederick, like, what are the blind spots that we have in this movement? And he said one blind spot he had when he wrote the book was realizing that he, as a kind of white, middle class, cishet man, etc., it's much easier for someone like him
Mm,
to bring their whole self to work. And there's been some criticism of that concept by, people of color, for example, who might say, it's not safe for me to bring my whole self out my front door, let alone to work. So what this writer was saying was they had also a 4-box model where they were saying that rather than aiming for some kind of performative authenticity, because again, the kind of pendulum swing would be, okay, if I bring my whole self to work, then it means I can dump all of my needs and trauma and projections and then expect the organization or my team members to take care of it. And I don't take any responsibility for that. So that also doesn't work. So they were saying that we want to be able to hold these two tensions or polarities of aliveness and uh, and responsive commitment, I think they said. So what that means is, like, they were giving the example of a therapist, who might have warm feelings towards their client, and they can be aware of that, but it might not be appropriate for them to hug their client.
right.
Um, and so it's not like either or. It's rather that's the responsive part. So
Mm,
sort of wholeness or authenticity or vulnerability or all those things, that you were talking about, the kind of inner shift, the consciousness raising, if you like, is being able to discern with those dimensions of like aliveness and responsive commitment. What am I choosing here? Like, maybe I choose to share something vulnerable, like in this meeting, I know we only have a short amount of time, and yet I have to name something
yeah.
difficult, and I choose to do that. And another time I might say, I'm going to notice that I feel that, not suppress that or deny that, and then maybe choose not to say it or choose another moment to bring it up. And that's the kind of responsive commitment bit. So, like,
Mm,
what's the commitment to? It's kind of balancing, again, the individual and the whole or the collective, and
yes.
trying to discern and choose what I might be or say or do in any moment.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because it's also a self-evaluation of the, also not just self but the situation, and then also understanding, reading the room, right? Also being able to know when and where is the time. And I think what you were saying earlier with the conflict, it's exactly maybe the space where, well, to lower the guards and like just to
Mm,
be to be to find a new way of dealing with things. It's way easier through vulnerability and just opening up how you're feeling, right? But yeah, when you're in
Yeah.
maybe the middle of a meeting where it's just efficiency needed and just like let's just focus on this, and it's
Mm.
maybe time to actually like come up with all.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we might have, each of us will be on a different place in terms of our comfort zone or our tendency. So I'm a recovering people pleaser. So for me, the learning edge has been choosing to share more often than I would have done. I've been conditioned not to share. So my learning edge has been daring to share things.
Yeah.
And someone else who maybe has, been rewarded or, has always been able to do that, their learning edge might be discerning when not to do that,
Yeah.
when to
Very
choose
good
for the
point.
benefit of the collective that this is not most important to share right now.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's a very good point. Also, another point of the book from Frederic Laloux, the living organism, like seeing the organization as a living organism and a purpose-driven organization, right? Um, when I read that part of the book, I felt that there was a very big spiritual aspect to it, and that we barely talk about spirituality inside of business, or even kind of relating spirituality to business. What has been your maybe journey with that also in these years of seeing and working in this transformation?
Yeah, what an interesting question. I think what comes to mind for me is like one of the paradigm shifts in how we relate to work in society nowadays has been an expectation that work should fulfill many more needs than it used to. Um, like I was even looking at a infographic this morning of like where people meet their romantic partner, and it used to be family or community or church or whatever, where you would meet your partner, and then over time it's become more like online or at work. But I think now we have an expectation that we spend a lot of time at work, and because we maybe also have lost a little bit our sense of community and we live in more individualized societies, work suddenly becomes a site where we expect to have, development, like deep relationships, all of these different things, spiritual, my life's purpose should be fulfilled by my work rather than just, getting my paycheck. And this is not everyone, but like broadly speaking, I think there's been a shift in that expectation. And also I think because we've also seen a shift societally in people's awareness of like mental health and well-being, and like we have, for good and for bad sometimes, a greater understanding of like trauma awareness and things like this, and more people are likely to get coaching or therapy. So I think people are somewhat more open to talking about deeper things, more spiritual things. So that's kind of interesting. And again, like, going back to Gen Z, like they're for them, it's not interesting enough to just like, there's some interesting statistics about in traditional companies how younger generations are shunning management roles. If they're offered, here, if you want to progress in your career, here's a manager role, and they're going, if that's the only path, no thanks. And organizations are like, what? But I think that shows that like we're more driven by, no, it's not just about the money or the status. I want to have, um, I want to make an impact, and I also don't want that to come at the cost of my own well-being.
Mm. Yeah. No, no, I can see that for sure, for sure. I have a background also in hospitality consulting, and I thought maybe also it could be very interesting for maybe more traditional businesses outside of the corporate world to also adapt a little bit of a different way of working, which has been a bit more challenging for me when I introduce these concepts. Um, I usually like it's usually smaller businesses where they have their own investment in there. It's like their own money. So I really understand it's high risk maybe at first. You look at it and you're like, well, it's what we were talking before earlier. But how do you see, maybe outside of the corporate world, do you see a also way of adapting a different way of working? And what would be your way to introduce that maybe? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's funny that in many ways it seems challenging to uh, adopt more decentralized ways of working in the hospitality sector, because you would think, being like a service oriented
Yeah.
sector, that this would be more embraced or more commonplace. But that was the organization I work with, Tough Leadership Training. One of our founders, Karen Tenelius, her background was also in the hospitality sector, and she was reading all of these books back then in the 80s, 90s. And back then, even, they were saying, the best service happens when those on the front lines are empowered to make decisions that best serve the customer or the person that you're supporting. So it's not rocket science, but so few organizations really embrace that, to the full extent. Um, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I mean, they are quite hierarchical usually. Like, take a restaurant, like the sort of chefs and waiters and everything. It's quite ingrained, that hierarchy. But also, like, I think a lot of what's interesting too, if you take another lens, like, a lot of people now are, like, I was reading a blog the other day of someone who they had sort of rejected their city jobs, and they had bought a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, and they were going to have an intentional community come and work on the farm and tend to the farm and live in a more community oriented, rejecting the sort of capitalist paradigm. And they bumped into all of these same challenges that we've been talking about. So even if you're not a business, even if you're, a group of human beings who are trying to do something really, or take things like the Occupy movement or these social activist groups, right? We all fall into the same traps because we're human beings, and we struggle with how to reconcile this hierarchical dynamic. And if you don't reconcile that, then you end up with this kind of power vacuum, leadership vacuum, accountability vacuum. So I think in whatever group of human beings you are, if you have a shared purpose as a group of human beings and you want to have a participatory culture where everyone shapes, that collective, then these principles are relevant, but they're not easy. And it takes practice and it takes commitment.
Yes. 100%. No, yeah. How do you see in that regard technology maybe helping us to, yeah, maybe have some more structures, something a little bit like Ved? The other day, I talked to Ved Krishna, and he has this very big company where he was saying how they try to build these self-actualizing systems. And I could imagine maybe that technology in that regard could really help to maybe do something a little bit less, more decentralized, less, more protocol based, maybe. I don't know. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I think it's definitely helpful for organizations that want to operate at scale. So Buurtzorg, that I've mentioned a couple of times, this healthcare organization in the Netherlands, 15,000 people, they have a very lean, centralized team. It's only like 10 people or something like that. They don't have managers. They have self-managing teams of 12. They have coaches that can support those teams, but they don't decide things for them. But a key part of their success has been their technology, their IT system that was part of their model from the very beginning, which empowers nurses. Like, they have tablets and they have all of their data on the tablet, and they also shared a lot of things. They have like an intranet where Yoss and others regularly blog about things they're learning, so that one team might say, hey, in Houghton, we have been developing a system to not only help the elderly, when they have injuries, but actually to help educate them of how to prevent injuries, how to safe-proof their house and things like this. And rather than one person, Yoss, the founder, or someone else saying, yes, let's roll that out across the whole organization, he would encourage them to kind of blog about it and say, here is the sort of toolkit of what we've done. And if you want to implement it in your region, here's how you do that. And let it kind of organically spread across the organization. If it's a good idea, it will spread. And you see that in other organizations too, like Hire is like a huge Chinese originally white goods manufacturer, like 100,000 people or something. And they have these self-managed micro enterprises, and they use things like smart contracts on blockchain to help organize that. Well, the very first self-managing company I ever visited was an aerospace company. And they had mapped out what they called recipes. And I forget how many they had, like, I don't know, 92 different recipes of everything that a project manager would need, like how to send a quote, how to raise an invoice, how to, etc. And they built a custom IT software that did all of those things. So it prompted you. And so you could then spend your time as an autonomous individual working on the stuff that matters, the client relationships, or the, innovating a product or whatever. And all of the kind of boring, dry stuff was taken care of in this system,
Right. So cool. You also mentioned to me last time we met that you're writing your own book right now. It's your second one already, but this one is just you, right? The other one was
Yes.
written. Can you share a bit about what you're writing about, and what is your area of interest right now?
So the general purpose of the book is to help people who experience this kind of pendulum of doom, as I've mentioned. So when any group of people want to explore more decentralized, participatory ways of working, it's very easy to swing into the other extreme and experience all kinds of problems there. And then when you have a crisis or you get to a certain size, it's easy to then swing back to the traditional top-down way of organizing. So it's these sort of swings, these extremes that harm us, I think. And when those happen, it's usually because we're not aware that there is an alternative. So we go to what's familiar or what's kind of automatic, rather than really choosing how to respond. So the book will be about how to support people, groups of people, organizations, whatever it is you're working on, to become aware of those swings and what to do when you catch yourself in those moments. And a key part of it is and a key part of, in general, like organizing in this way, for example, is kind of embracing paradoxes, kind of the world of both and. So it's not only freedom, because if it's too much freedom, that's how you get this kind of abdicated power vacuum kind of thing. And it's also not, only responsibility, because then you get this rigid sort of punitive system. So it's like, how can we create design, organizations, cultures, systems that embrace both freedom and responsibility? And what does that look like? What are some examples? What are the practices for doing that? What's the mindset shift that we need to undergo? So that's the idea, is to sort of support people through that kind of groan zone of going from one paradigm to another, and avoiding the kind of reactive reverting to type that sort of goes against our values.
Then I think it's very much needed. And how do you trust, even if things maybe go wrong and it's a process, and like you are in the middle of the pendulum and you're like, well, this didn't work, but maybe this, but how can you just let go of that control instinct thing? That thing of, oh, I this didn't go so well. Like, how do you of this control thing?
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question because, even if you do realize that you've done the pendulum swing, the tendency then again in the kind of parent-child dynamic is to try and fix it
Yeah.
and kind of helicopter in some kind of solution, which again kind of undermines the system we're trying to create. So a metaphor that helped me some years ago was the metaphor of like a spider web,
Okay.
which I got from Margaret Wheatley in her book Leadership and the New Science, where she was saying that we need the same paradigm shift in leadership and in organizations as we had in science when we went from one paradigm of science to the introduction of quantum science,
Yeah.
which sort of totally turned everything upside down, right? So she said we need the same quantum shift in leadership in organizations. And in that book, she talks about, when there's a problem or an issue, if there's a break in a spider web, what does the spider do? It connects the web to more of itself. So the same is true of organizations. So when you realize, okay, there's a tension here or there's a problem, rather than trying to solve that, it's like, how can we connect the web to more of itself? What conversations need to be happening? Who needs to be present to something? So, for example, I remember Frederick also gave an example of a hospital where there were two departments and one department was overworked and the other department had lots of spare capacity. And the CEO was asking Frederick, how can I get them to see that they're struggling and get them to offer some of their resources to that team? And he said, well, right now, they're not directly feeling the pain of that. So it's not for you to design any solutions, for you to perhaps put them in a room together and for one department to hear the other department's pain directly. And then, they're human beings. So of course, then they immediately are like, well, hey, we have spare capacity. We'll help you. You're suffering. And that's a total different kind of ownership than if the CEO had said, I'm appointing two of your people to this team because they're overworked, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. Yes. No, at the end of the day, it's quite simple, isn't it? But it just sometimes, we get in there with the helicopter parent mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so seductive.
So much. We also talked about social justice once, and how it's very maybe similar to this transition. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been drawing a lot of inspiration from people in the social justice movement who are writing about a lot of the same challenges, but they're kind of coming from a different angle and perhaps not aware of that people over here in the sort of self-management community are struggling with the same things. So like two women that I came across recently, one, Amara Spence, who's a British artist and social activist, who wrote this brilliant blog about what she calls radical hospitality, which is kind of her talking about how organizations cannot be homes for everyone's individualized needs and wounds and all of that stuff, but they can be temporary hosts. And so she talks about belonging and inclusion then doesn't mean like unconditional acceptance, but means mutual accountability.
Right.
And like, honestly, like I highlighted pretty much every sentence of that blog she wrote. It's so good. So many touches on a lot of things that we've been talking about. And then another social justice think she's a disability justice activist, actually, called Mia Mingus. And she talks about accountability and how she has a really great blog, actually, about how to write a good apology or how to give a good apology and the different pieces of that that make up kind of mutual accountability, and how we need to reframe how we relate to accountability, not as something kind of punitive or, holding people to account, we often say, but rather supporting each other to proactively take accountability. It's just like a totally different way of thinking about it. And if we can't, you know, hold each other account, you and I, for example, in just this fractal of two people, then how on earth can we hold governments to account or cities to account? Or so again, they're kind of pointing to this inner shift and relational shift that we need to practice if we want to shift our systems.
Right. And how do we do that?
Yeah,
Little-
it's $1 million question. Well, I mean, I think um, I think like we spoke about before with the 3 shifts, like, so there's the structures and processes part and the inner part. And I think the inner part, again, like what Mia said, was trying to practice it on a micro level. So she suggests this activity, which I really liked, of like buddying up with someone. So you and I could pair up together and share something we want to be accountable to ourselves for. So I might say, Adriana, I want to be accountable for drinking more water,
Mhm.
drinking a liter of water every day or whatever. And you might say, I want to be accountable to myself for making sure I get 30 minutes of movement every day. And then we would meet, a couple weeks later and share, how's it going with that? Did you manage to hold yourself accountable for that or not? And then noticing, if I have failed, do I feel feelings of guilt, shame? Do I want to give excuses? And if you have failed, do I find myself wanting to take care of you or tell you off or give you advice? Or, so you start to notice on a micro level, what are our internalized experiences of accountability?
Mm.
And then maybe start to consciously practice. How is it? Again, like if I'm a people pleaser, I might not want to hold you to account because I want you to like me.
Right.
But if I'm really, again, to that kind of responsive commitment thing I was talking about before, my colleague Karen likes to say that coaching is holding someone to account for who they said they wanted to be. So if I really care about you, and, many of us have good friends that do this for us, they'll lovingly hold you to account for something and say, well, hey, Adriana, you said you wanted to have 30 minutes of movement every day, and you told me that was really important. And I hear that, you keep letting yourself off the hook with that. So how can I support you to take accountability for that thing that I know you said was important?
Yeah. 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 That's such a good point. And yeah, also maybe asking the question, no, of why am I not being just why am I not holding myself accountable for these things? Like, what's going on here?
Mm,
Because if it's that important to me, why am I not doing that? Or
yeah. And
mm,
again, like the parental tendency might be like, hey, so what I found really helpful is if I write it in my calendar, and I'll give you all of the advice of what works for me. And I read a great thing once that like giving someone advice is like giving someone a large amount of foreign currency that they don't know how to spend.
wow, that is genius. I love
Isn't that
that.
great? I think it was in Michael Bungay Stanier's book. So that advice might be great for me, but it might be utterly useless to you.
Totally.
So
Yes.
you're right. Instead, it's like being curious, asking questions like, what's the biggest obstacle for you
Mm,
not getting 30 minutes of movement every day?
yeah.
Or like, what do you think would help you? Or it's like being more coaching.
Love it. Already going into the more ending questions. What is something that has recently surprised you?
Juicy question.
Yeah, I know. also be something that you have learned that has been very eye-opening.
Mm. I don't know. What popped into my head was I was leading a training a few months ago with this self-managing energy company, a renewable energy company. And we were exploring a lot of these ideas we've been talking about, how to break this parent-child dynamic. And they are a company working without traditional hierarchy. And I was having a beer in the pub afterwards with some of the participants in this course. And one of them said to me, hey, my partner is someone who practices polyamory. And there's so much of what he talks about in the polyamory community that resonates with all of these principles that we're talking about in terms of working in a self-managing way together, um, which is super interesting and not necessarily surprising to me because I did actually have a conversation with someone on my podcast about that. But sort of, he then wrote a blog about this topic and pointing out all the different ways. And for me, I love things like that where you see these kind of adjacent but different fields or communities
Yeah.
where there are these beautiful like crossovers, and overlaps, and how bridging those worlds can bring new richness to whatever field you're practicing in. So I just loved that. There's a lot of stuff about clear agreements, lots of communication, all sorts of, it's super interesting.
It makes so much sense. And I mean, it is at the end of the day, it's just like, yeah, being a human being, what you said earlier. So in all sorts of human settings that we come together, we will experience those similar things.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense that then, yeah. So in the polyamorous community is like, well, same here.
Yeah. It's just all about relationships.
Amazing. And how do you see us maybe in regards of more organizational structures and initiatives and processes in 5 to 10 years, more or less? Like, where do you see us being?
There was a nice thing at this conference I mentioned, the Corporate Rebels conference in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, where they opened the whole conference with a imaginary Netflix documentary kind of title card. And they were like, imagine in 40 years time, you put Netflix on, if Netflix still exists.
No.
Who knows these days?
Right.
And you see this documentary like The Work Revolution, and you watch it and you recognize people in this room in that documentary who are practicing, pioneering organization. So it was a really nice kind of visioning exercise of like, imagine in the future, these people you're surrounded with will be in this documentary of like, wow, there was this group of people who revolutionized work. So I like to think that a lot of these things that you and I are talking about now in 5 to 10 years will not be so rare or radical, but I don't have the illusion that they'll be like widespread and it will be the mainstream. But maybe someone had a beautiful metaphor where they were saying, maybe self-managing organizations are quite rare and will always be. But if you think about ecosystems like the ocean and coral reefs, coral reefs only cover a small fraction of the ocean floor or the whole ocean ecosystem, but they have a huge impact on the vibrance and the health of the ocean, right? So maybe these kinds of organizations can be that kind of like a small but crucial piece of a wider ecosystem, and some of the DNA from these ways of working can infiltrate those more mainstream systems. It may not look as radical, it's
Yeah.
going to be a spectrum,
Yeah.
but embracing some of these ideals.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it kind of, yeah, connects to the idea of we're all one. So
Mm,
it's this massive ripple effect, right?
yes.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I love that you were suggesting it. Well, depending on if Netflix still exists or not, I could also see that actually we will move maybe into more smaller organizations or something. I don't know. Um, We'll
Yeah, that
see.
would be nice, because right now it seems like we're heading to more and more monopolies, like this latest acquisition of Warner Brothers and Netflix and all of that. But let's see.
But yeah, well, we shall see. What is the new world in the making for you? Since the podcast is called like that, I always ask that question.
What is the new world in the making for me? I think what comes up for me is, and again, it's something Margaret Wheatley said in that book I referenced earlier. She said that we have not yet learned how to live in this new age of relationships. And she wrote that book, I think, like 20 years ago. But I think the new world in the making for me is that we are reevaluating relationships. I think like we're reevaluating what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a good leader. And I think, yeah, we're sort of in this loneliness epidemic, this mental health crisis, and AI looming. It's making us question, what is it to be human and what is it to be in relationship? So I hope that the new world in the making is more intentionally, more consciously looking at what it means to be in relationship with each other, with the planet, with whatever, and how we can influence that relationship, as co-producers rather than consumers of our relationships. That we can at any moment choose to make our relationships anew.
I love that you said co-producers, and it brings us back into the picture and not this like passive consuming individual. Yeah, it's such a massive point, I think, about agency, right? Because I feel that we are constantly being, asked to kind of not have agency. This is kind of completely the opposite. No, we are creators.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I always end with a question. So a question for you to ask the listeners so that they can reflect upon and just, stay with that question. What question would that be?
I think as we are recording this conversation towards the end of 2025, maybe I'll ask listeners a question to reflect on for next year, for 2026, which could be, what is a bold commitment you make to yourself for 2026?
I love that. I think that's gonna be my starting letter to myself for the 2026. I love that. Thanks a lot, Lisa. I really enjoyed this a lot. And anything else you'd like to add?
No, just, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it as well, and I hope it resonates for listeners.
Definitely think so. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.